Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here. We're doing nap time again with my new little one. So maybe a little bit quieter today, but who can tell? We'll soon see. I'll try to fix this in post if it's a little bit quiet. But today we're taking a look at Commissars. We're over to the rifle platoon finally. And so as we start looking at some of those HQ options that are available, and some that are available almost more like a high command sort of perspective, one per army, we come today to the Commissar. And in what is perhaps a controversial take on these. I think they're pretty bad, actually. I think there's basically nothing that they do that's particularly good. I think they're an active liability in some aspects of the game, and they might actually cost you a couple matches that you would otherwise win. So, in my humble opinion, I don't like these. Even the argument of it's a cheap order dice, as we'll soon see a little bit later in about 3 minutes or so, depending on how quickly we move through some of this stuff, you're going to find I don't even find that to be that convincing. So while I own a commissar, while I have used commissars, and I speak here from some experience having used commissars, I don't like them. And I don't think they're all that good. If you want to run them by all means, but I have found that when I run Soviet lists, very commonly, if I can, I leave these at home. And so taking a quick look at what's going on, again, we're looking at the same things that we've been looking at for all of these so far. Trying to give the benefit of the doubt. We're going to be looking at their ability to provide fire for your army, their ability to pin, their ability to damage, what you're passing up in order to take these guys and whether it's worth the cost. We'll look at objective holding and objective taking, which might be an eye opener for you on how these guys actually work. And then finally, in as much as you have them, how to do target prioritization effectively. So to start off with, there has been a pretty big change with third edition coming out of second edition in that you can now take up to 4 extra people in this squad. So this can now be a squad of 5, which as I recall is more than we had access to in second edition. If you choose to take them with rifles, you can get around 1 to 5 shots at 24 inches, right? Depending on how many of those you want to take. If you take submachine gun, you're getting 2 shots each at 12 inches, and you do get the assault keyword, so there's no penalty for moving and shooting, which is really nice because you're already getting a penalty for being inexperienced, and so we don't want that. But you'd also get the tough fighter special rule, which being inexperienced doesn't cause a negative with, which is nice. And then you have the pistol. If you choose to take them cheaper with the pistol, it's going to be 1 shot at 6 inches for each of these. Do note that while technically you can take up to 5 people, the overwhelming majority of players are going to run this as a one-man squad, maybe with 1 extra man. But in general, they're going to run this super cheap, right? Because they're going for like a 14, 15 point squad. And that's the whole reason why they're taking it, right? More on that in a little bit. The critical thing here is that your volume overall, regardless of what you take, is going to be pretty low. So one should not expect this to be a great pinning unit. One should not expect this to be a great removal unit. Though obviously, if you get 5 submachine guns and you can get to point blank range, like it's not horrible. You're looking at like 3s or 4s to hit, depending on whether you have pins on you or not, which is not bad. It does mean you have to get that squad up there, which is probably going to require a transport of some kind. So, like you are investing in a serious investment at that point, right? But in as much as you want to keep it cheap, you can keep it cheap. And if you want to really invest in volume, you can technically get it out of this squad. And so when looking at opportunity cost, the first thing we have to consider is the not one step back special rule, right? And I've reproduced it over here on the right-hand side so that way you can see it, okay? But basically, if a model has at least 3 or more models in it, okay, which is to say a big change from second edition where you could have a 2-man squad that fails an order test, the commissar shoots one of them to see if they repeat their order test, and then you also have to check to see if they morale tested for fleeing the battlefield because you lost half or more of the unit. And I think technically it even allowed you, if you had a 1-man squad that failed an order test, he might get shot. But now at least they've removed that. So that's a good thing. Okay. Good update. Thank you for the rules update, guys. That was a very, very good call. A+ Warlord. Okay. But what happens is it means that as long as it's a friendly infantry unit that fails an order test within 6 inches of the commissar, which technically speaking probably includes the commissar, because typically they will say another unit if it doesn't apply to itself. And this is worded the same way that officer morale bubbles in Snap 2s are worded, right? Where, it's just friendly units would increase their morale by whatever, which does include the officer himself, right? So just keep in mind that that's an interesting question, and I'd be very curious to see what the take is on that. But what happens is if they fail the order test, then you remove a model and you re-perform the roll. Okay, you get a chance to re-roll the roll, which on the one hand feels good, right? Because it gives you a chance, if you just barely failed something, to get a second chance at redemption. On the other hand, it's not free, right? And we're going to be looking at this more next week when we look at the Kemptai officer, okay? But for this week, as we're looking at the Commissar, note that this is not a free bonus, okay? Second thing to note about it, and this is important, is that it does start at 15 points in experience, but if you take him with a pistol, he goes down to 14, okay? Which means, I mean, he's a pretty cheap order dice. You can only take one of him because he's a high command style unit, and so regardless of how many platoons you have, you can only take one of him per army, per force, which is important because it means, as we'll see later, it's not something we can really kind of max out on, right? It's not like, once again, the Kemptai officer we'll be talking about next week, where you can take one per rifle platoon. This one is one per army. Cannot have more than one of these. So while it is a cheap order dice, it is exactly one cheap order dice. In addition, you don't get access to any subtypes. So, while it would be kind of nice to maybe take this guy 14 points in experience, maybe with, like, say, the Naval Brigade upgrade, where now at least he's only one man, but at least he has tough fighters. So there's a reason not to just rush in on him. He might remove one of your models. And so, like, that could be kind of nice. It could be kind of nice giving him fanatics, because then at least if he does get pinned and he's just going down every single turn, trying to keep the rest of the guys, keep them activating. At the very least, he's not going to run away due to pins, which when you start on morale of 8 is really nice. So, not that I think any of the upgrades for the Soviet Union are particularly great on a Commissar, but depending on the style of unit that you're running, depending on how many bodies you want to have in this thing, it would be kind of nice to have some of these subtypes, especially the Fanatics upgrade. But alas, we don't get access to that. You can, however, take a victory banner. Now, this is a 20-point upgrade that grants units within 12 inches of him and line of sight of him a +1 morale bonus, which on the one hand is kind of nice because it means that on that reroll, you're less likely to still be failing after shooting one of your own guys, right? Which is good. Do keep in mind you can only take one victory banner, okay, in your entire force. So that's something we're thinking about. But another thing, and very critical to our discussion here, is that while, yes, one does have the ability to add a +1 morale, first of all, you are making yourself a not cheap order dice by the time you do this, because you have to take a second person who's going to cost at least 6 points, assuming they have a pistol, and then 20 more points for a victory banner. So now you're looking at a 40-point unit, right? Minimum. And that assumes that we only have one extra guy in the squad, right? Which means if we suffer even one casualty, we no longer have a victory banner. So at that point, this is not a cheap order dice anymore. You are much better off going with things like AT rifles if that's what you really, really want, is cheap order dice. It also it kind of mitigates the uh, the actual commissar ability, because with that +1 morale bonus, which is separate from things like, say, an officer morale bonus, so as far as I know, they would stack. Like, you're just less likely to be using a reroll. So, like, what is he doing? Right? He's really not doing much, and he's not even a cheap caddy for this thing, because again, he's at least 40 points, right? And that assumes that you're okay with one thing costing you the whole banner upgrade, right? Which is not bad. Furthermore, and this is again a really big deal, we're going to be talking about a little bit later, is the fact that because he has to be within line of sight, there's a better chance that you're going to get shot at. And that could be really, really bad. You can also take a guard dog, which on the one hand, you're paying 2 points for a tough fighter, a single tough fighter in the squad, which on the one hand is kind of useful. You also get to detect hidden units further than normal, okay? But again, that's not going to come up in your standard piece of play. I don't know, one tough fighter in my experience is not worth that much, personally. So I don't think I would do this. And again, it's not like if we're being charged we're inexperienced, we're not going to win that fight anyway, no matter what way you end up cutting that. And so, I don't know, like, as I look at this, you're not actually getting much from the actual profile, right? You tell yourself it's a cheap order dice, right? And this is typically what we would talk about here in the opportunity cost section, and we are going to talk about this in the Kemptai video next week as well. But honestly, I'm not sure it's actually as cheap as you think it is. For starters, as we mentioned, minimum of 14 points. 14 points is relatively cheap in this game. Of course, you're fielding one of these total for your entire army, right? And you can't maximize on it for volume like you can, say, with tows, transports, or even some of your AT options, right? For slightly more, you get an AT rifle who is arguably more useful, right? You can get two horse-drawn limbers in an artillery platoon, which is a really good platoon for the Soviet Union, by the way, for the same cost as just this guy, right? You can, and if you take him with a if you take him with an extra man and the victory banner as a relatively cheap caddy for your victory banner, you can take five horse-drawn limbers slash boats, to borrow from Navy Week, for the same cost as this one unit. And that's only a 40-point inexperienced unit, right? So I don't know, man. Like, even as a cheap order dice, is it really? Right? I mean, it would in most armies be a really cheap order dice, and thus an automatic go-to. The problem is we're talking about the Soviet Union, where in a single rifle platoon, you can take Strafbot infantry, super cheap, only 25 points in experience in your rifle sections. You can take two AT rifles as a single slot. You can take two more light mortars on top of that. So you could have easily 8 order dice just in your rifle platoon, paying 25 points or less for each of them, right? So, for 200 points, under 225, if you include the officer, you've already got 9 order dice stacked up. So now you have 750 points at 1,000 points at 1,250 that you can spend on basically whatever you want. Do you really need this guy? Like, how much is he padding your margin? I think that's a legitimate question, especially since he's actively removing your own models for a limited gain. And this is important from an opportunity cost perspective. First of all, as you'll notice in the rule over there, when they perform the reroll, there's no ignoring pins. So if the opponent pins a bunch of your units down, and then you start taking order tests, and you're having to tech on something like a 5 or a 6, and you fail, it's not like you then get to test on normal unmodified morale. You get to test again on the same 5 or 6 that you're aiming for, which is not good. And so the chance that you lost a model and still failed the order test is bad. Forget about the fact that there's a 3% chance that if you just barely failed it last time and you're very likely to succeed a second time, you might foobar. Because it's not like the second die test cannot get a 12, right? So forget about the fact you are inviting a second 3% chance to try to shoot your own men or run off the table, which is also a possibility. Like this in my book is not actually as useful as people make it out to be. It is nice when you have one pin, maybe 2 pins, and when you have an officer nearby. And this is part of the argument for the victory banner. Okay. Though admittedly, again, okay, well, now you pass it. So now you're paying extra points effectively for what? Right? When you could take the victory banner on an inexperienced infantry unit instead, or an officer, which you were already going to buy, and turn your officer into a increased morale bonus unit, right? Like, so I'm just saying the way that the rule, the not one step back rule is worded, doesn't actually make your odds of passing that much better. It helps a bit when you have a tiny margin, but with a tiny margin, that's what officers are for, right? To make it so you're passing on 11s instead of passing on whatever the unmodified, whatever the new modified version is. Okay. The second issue is you only need to fail 2 order tests with anything, possibly only one, depending on the kind of unit in question, and suddenly your opponent has made back the value that you paid on your own commissar, right? If you fail 2 order tests with inexperienced troops, assuming that they're not Strafbot, that only cost 5 points per man, they've made their points back because you coughed up 14 points, which is how much you paid for the commissar, right? And you made it easier to remove those units in the first place. So I'm not a fan. If you're losing regular troops, or heaven forbid, a veteran soldier, due to excessive pinning, and you think, I got a 9 to pass, there's no way I'm going to fail a 9. And then you do, you remove a 13, 14, 21-point model. I don't like it. I don't like it. 22 points. 22 points if it's a veteran Soviet tank rider with the body armor and the submachine guns. I don't like it. Okay, so I know people, they like their commissars. I don't. Okay, for this very reason. All it takes is me botching one roll. Forget a foobar for a moment. All it takes is one botched roll, and I have coughed up more value than I got from this unit in the first place. And furthermore, and this is the biggest thing, it is an extremely fragile unit for its cost, right? I mean, your average person is not paying 14 to 15 points for a single wound on threes, right? The only time you see that potentially is officers, but officers don't have to be in line of sight to give the bonus of their, of their morale bubble, like you would need to have with the victory banner if it's here on the commissar. Technically speaking, for what it's worth, you don't need line of sight on the commissar shooting people either, which is a very interesting thing just to think about. That's true. You could shoot through a building, in order to, or through a ruin to a unit that you normally wouldn't be able to do. He just heard somebody was doing it, and I guess started popping off rounds until he heard somebody scream. There's all kinds of, realistic questions as to how that works, but suffice it to say, uh, again, like this is a lot of points to spend for a potential, oh, I'm just gonna whip around really quick with a machine gun and shoot and mow you down, right? Which is relatively easy to do in this game, especially since so many nations are now getting bonuses to coming in from outflank. So just suffice it to say, I don't know, man. I look at the opportunity cost and I think to myself, I can spend 14 to 15 points better while still having an exceptional number of order dice. And this doesn't mean I never run one, but it means I'm honest about the fact that if I can remove it and still get to the minimums that I want, I typically do because I don't strictly need this guy. He's not providing nearly as much as other officers, and especially things in that chaplainy sort of role can do for you. And when looking at pin generation, this doesn't get any better, right? I mean, with your rifles, you're looking at maybe 2 pins per game, very possibly none, especially if, again, you're running this as a single man, right? If you're running this single man, there's a very good chance that you're not going to get any pins at all, either because you're just not going to put him in a place where he can be seen by something, or two, and also very probably because he's already starting on fives to hit. That assumes he has no pins. It assumes he hasn't moved at all. This is one of those units in the game where you could get super sixes in order to hit, which is not good odds, right? So suffice to say, I don't think pins are very good with the rifle. Some machine guns, it's slightly better. You can get up to reliably about 4. The biggest issue is that, first of all, that 4 doesn't come from a single man with submachine guns. So you're easily paying for a 60 plus point unit in order to take this. But hypothetically, if you were to max out and start taking it, you're getting close to like 65 points for a 5-man inexperienced unit with submachine guns, right? Or something like that. It's going to be relatively expensive. When you start bulking it out, you can get good volume. Because again, you're going to start on 4s, becomes 5s for being inexperienced. No penalties for moving and shooting. Could go to 6s if you have pins on you. But then if you can get to point blank range, which is not all ranges with a submachine gun, which is where it differs from the pistol, which we'll talk about later, you would hypothetically be able to get it down to 4s, at which point you could reliably get about 3 pins per game. And even if you were going closer to 6s, if you have enough of these guys, if you're firing at least 3 of these guys, you can get up to 4 or 5 pretty reliably. Okay. The trick, of course, is that, again, you have to kind of stack everything just perfectly. I know there are people, including some friends of mine, who really, really believe in inexperienced units with submachine guns. I applaud you. Keep up the good work. Do what you want to do. I don't tend to like it, and I tend to find the volume is very swingy. If I can get a large number of models up there, and if the transport survives, and if they don't have a lot of units on ambush, then yeah, it works out fine. But short of that, I don't tend to find it to be particularly good. And then finally with the pistol, the biggest issue with the pistols, of course, is you just have to get so dang close that you're almost guaranteed to be losing bodies before you even get there. So honestly, I'd be surprised if you get more than 1 pin, to be honest. And there's a very good chance you're just going to say, I'm just going to cat him in the back. We're not going to move up. We're just going to trust that he's not supposed to be shooting. And if he is shooting, then something really bad has happened. And he very well might get away with 0 pins for the stuff. So, I mean, this is extremely low. It's even low for being a cheap order dice, right? I mean, when we looked at AT rifles can reliably get about 3 per game, right? It depends on how long they live and how many targets they have, whether you're outflanking them, things like that. But they can reliably get at least 2 to 3 in any given game. This guy, we're working in order to get there, okay? And of course, the biggest issue is the fact that you have to, you're starting on 5s, right? I mean, whatever weapon you're working with, you are starting on 5s because you at least have the starting on 4s with inexperienced. Everything else is a modifier after that. And so, I don't know, like from a pin generating perspective, I wouldn't anticipate getting much from this guy unless you're willing to pay for something on par with a rifle section. And when looking at damage, it's not very good. Obviously, the submachine gun is pretty reasonable. And if you have five pistols all shooting, then for their cost, they're actually pretty reasonable. Okay. But then again, just remember that this five pistol math is the same thing we're going to see for five rifle math for literally like every squad we're going to be looking at as part of our 12-part series on on infantry builds, okay, that we're going to be doing as part of the rifle platoons. That's right. Stay tuned. We're going to have about a whole quarter of the year where we're just talking about different infantry sections. It's going to be great. But just know that when you see this number over here, that is the baseline for the overwhelming majority of infantry and sometimes better than that. Okay. So, and that assumes that you're willing to spend an awful lot of points, right? Almost 50 points to take five dudes, all with pistols, possibly with a victory banner, because at that point you might as well, like kind of you can actually keep the banner alive for a reasonable amount of time. Um, this is not good math. Okay, that's all you need to know. Okay, it's about 38 points, assuming no victory banner, right? So, and that's take five pistols. Like you still have to get within 6 inches. So, like, how many shots are you actually going to get with five pistols? I don't know that you're going to get very many. Maybe one sneakily coming out of a transport really quick and then jumping in and getting the work done. Maybe. But that's probably the closest that you're going to get to that. If you take three submachine guns, it's only 33 points without a victory banner, which is not bad. It is more reliable and it does give you better reach and it gives you tough fighters. So if I was doing it, I would probably go for less guys with the SMGs over and against the pistols. If I wanted a damage unit, keep in mind, if you take a victory banner, that model has to have a pistol. Okay. So it throws off everything. Another option you could do is you could run at 29 points with him and two extra guys, all with rifles. And what the three rifles would do is you would get reasonable chances at pins. You get reasonable chances at wounding maybe inexperienced troops, because you probably sneak in one hit through on three shots. Sometimes it's less than that, but probably one. And that means if it's on threes, you're more likely than not to succeed. And it's better than a 50% chance. So, like, if you want something to just be a little winnowing troop, 29 points is not horrible. I think this is like the one redeeming place for Commissars, is they are a pretty reasonable support by fire unit taken as like a three-man rifle section. If you take them more than that, I think you're probably throwing away too many things. Um, and you're maybe investing a little too much into it, so suddenly it's now no longer a very cheap order dice. Just my personal opinion. But you can basically do with that what you will. When looking at objective holding, this thing's actually really bad. First of all, you're starting on a 3+ to wound, right? Which is not good. You do get cover, probably. Certainly, I'd hope that you would take cover on this thing. But that's pretty bad. This is like the lowest you can get in the game, right? The only thing that'd be worse than this is a really, really tall damage value 3+ vehicle, because then it's taller, so it's harder to get full cover from stuff, and it can't go down, right, as a reaction to things. So this is circling the bottom of the barrel, especially if you take it only one man, uh, for really, really bad. So really, you kind of need to think of this in one of two ways. From an objective holding standpoint, either this is just a super cheap unit to leave in control of an objective that you don't think is actually going to be pushed, which honestly is a perfectly fine way to use the Commissar, because again, its ability is actually quite dangerous to your own forces, especially when it comes to objective holding and objective taking missions, as you're about to see. So actually leaving him all alone on an objective is not the worst thing ever. Okay. The alternative option is that you take more bodies in the unit so it can actually help to hold something, and you just kind of hope that they can weather the storm. Okay. That's not always a good plan, and this is why, in my opinion, this is pretty bad, okay? But hypothetically, one can do that, okay? You're going to have 1 to 5 men inexperienced, hopefully with cover, which is not great, but there is one redeeming aspect, which we've already kind of hinted at, right? If you put this unit on ambush to buy time for yourself, or if you just wait, let people shoot it, and then go down every single time, one, there's nothing in the Commissar special rule that says that if you're down, you can't use that ability, as far as I can tell. So there's that. That's actually not a helpful thing, honestly, in some respects, as you'll soon see. But at least for here, it means that if you do need to hold an objective with this guy, especially if you take up to 5 people, you could just go down every single turn. And if you're going down with heavy cover, that's a 2+ save. That 3+ to wound is actually going to survive for quite a long time. Okay, which is not bad. And that's probably one of the few ways to do it. Again, it's not a very cheap unit at that point. So just something to think about. But suffice it to say, technically it can fulfill a role as an objective holder in that form. Okay. It is extremely easy to push off of an objective, especially at point blank range, because then going down doesn't help. You're getting an awful lot of hits on target. They're wounding with a lot of those, right? On average, we're going to be two-thirds of those, but there's a very high chance on a 3+ that they're going to go above average on that. And so the result is, I think you're going to evaporate very quickly. Okay. And well, you tell yourself, well, I'll just have other units around him to guard the same objective. So even if they remove him, it's perfectly fine. Here's the problem. What they're actually more likely to do is try to pin the units that are next to him as much as they can so that when those units activate, you might actually actively complicate your own defense because your unit might be testing again on something like nines, and then you roll like a 10 or 11, and you end up shooting one of your own guys, so you can reattempt the nine again, which maybe you pass, but now you shrunk your own defending units for the opponent. And in a game where even snipers don't get a 100% chance of hitting and then wounding a target, the Commissar has a 100% chance of not only getting a hit if you're within 6 inches, but doing a wound. It's the only unit in the game that gets this, right? With the sole exception, of course, of a really big HE blast blowing up a building. That's the only situation where there's a 100% chance of doing wounds. So like you can escort this with other troops. You might actually be better off just escorting it with vehicles because it does specify it has to be an infantry unit. Okay. It has to be a man, it has to be a physical body. So you could keep a mule team next. Well, I guess you don't get access to mule teams. You keep a horse and limber team next to him. And he won't shoot the horse for not following orders. Okay, that's kind of nice. I don't know how that actually helps you from a defense standpoint, seeing as the limber can't do it. You might consider putting a tank next to it. But suffice it to say, like if you're putting any infantry, if you're putting team weapons, I think artillery would even count as well. If they aren't listening, you might actually make it harder for you to defend your own objective, which in my opinion is not very good. So like if you're just looking for a puppy guard tax, if you think this is an objective that's not actually going to get pushed, it's a perfectly fine unit to drop on that, even if you take it just one man with a pistol. Perfectly fine. You just really better hope it never gets pushed because it's not a very survivable unit. And from an objective taking potential, like you kind of can. Technically, it's possible. It might even be necessary if you're running out of other infantry, but this is going to be extremely hard to do because, again, small squad, inexperienced, hope you get cover. That's not great for taking an objective. And more than that, you need to really watch out for counterattacks because it is extremely easy to push this unit off of an objective, especially if you've been moving it toward the enemy and you just clip in there, you're getting in range of the objective, maybe you're even in the objective and you flipped it for one turn, your opponent drops off almost literally anything. They're going to blow this unit off the table, okay? Especially if they're at point blank range. So while yes, it can technically take something, make sure that this unit is actively taking something that you don't think is going to be counterattacked. Because if it is, you might actually have a problem, most notably the fact that while you're pushing up, and or once you've claimed it, if the other units around you that are friendly to you have pins and they fail pins, you're going to be removing your own men. Okay? Which means maintaining that objective, actually taking that objective, you could cause yourself to lose a close combat, a close range shootout, all kinds of things. And it could cost you the game purely because your officer, for the love of the motherland, said, hey, you're not following orders. Pow! Keep going, okay? And again, it's not like it's a guaranteed automatic success after that, right? You could find that your guys who are supposed to be moving up not only fail and go down, they fail and go down with other people missing from the squad, right? Which is problematic, okay? Let alone in case you're re-rolling at the foo bar, right? Which again, we aren't even factoring into our whole conversation because it's only like a 3% chance. But if that does happen, they could end up shooting even more of your men, right? Which is problematic. So I'm just saying, like, you tell yourself a reroll on order test is nice for taking objectives. I'm not entirely sure that it is. I feel like it's better to just take an officer, put them nearby, and trust to having an 11 plus on morale in order to succeed on passing order tests. Because then, you know what? If you would 12 on a foo bar, you know what? You're probably just going to 12 on a foo bar anyway. Right? Like, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. Some smart person's probably going to say, well, if you had a commissar, then you could re-roll. It's like, well, yeah, you could re-roll. That is true. And then maybe you pass and maybe you get to go forward, and maybe you don't have enough men around by the time you get there to actually do the job. So I have questions, okay, on how effective this actually is. But if I'm trying to maximize this, okay, if I'm trying to tell you how to load out a commissar and you really, really want to run one, because again, sometimes I will run one just because I need to flesh it out. I need more order dice to throw in. I don't feel like adding a whole extra platoon, so I'm just going to add an extra guy and call it a day, right? You can take rifles. If so, you want to shoot at like two-man infantry squads, okay? Because you actually have a chance of maybe removing something. At the very least, you're pinning things, okay? You try to pin soft skin vehicles, that's fine. But I'm going to be honest, you're not going to get much out of the rifles. That's just the way it is. Not unless you're going to pay an awful lot of points. Some machine guns, like you can go after infantry teams, you can go after artillery. It can be a nice way of kind of just chipping away at infantry squads, especially inexperienced infantry squads. I don't think you're actually going to do very much else. Like maybe regulars is kind of swingy on the math on regulars, but like hypothetically you could. With pistols, I mean, that pistol's just for point defense. Okay, you're not going to be using it actively to hunt down enemy units. You really don't want to go looking for targets. You're going to lose these guys if you're running pistols. Okay. From a victory banner, you can take it here. It does allow you to kind of keep the unit back, which is nice, but you just have to keep them in line of sight of the units that you want to give the benefit to. So it does kind of expose you a little bit more. It's a lot harder to just kind of hide behind a building and be helping out the boys like, say, a company commander can, right? Where he's just shouting, they hear him from around the corner, but the enemy can't really see him, so they can't target him, they can't shoot at him, okay? So, like, you can take it here. I think there are other places I would personally prefer to take the victory banner. But if you want to take it here, like it's not a horrible idea, and it does help to keep the overall cost of the unit relatively low. And then finally, we've got the guard dogs. I would basically pass on this every time. If you could take a guard dog per person, that'd be awesome. As far as I see it, you can only take one guard dog. And in my opinion, one single tough fighter in the unit is not really worth it, even for only 2 points. I don't think that's really worthwhile. But what do you think? Do you think that I'm being way too harsh on the commissar? Do you think that I was being too generous? That this is an active trap, that you've been screaming this for years, and nobody's been listening to you, and I'm the first guy on the internet to say, you're right. You are absolutely right. There's dangers here that people are overlooking in the name of a cheap order dice. Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.